system. And I know that Diane and her colleagues are attempting to frame New Press in the scheme of the electronic universe. But I think the other way it has to be framed, a renewed frame, is in the argument over America's future. We can see that the election of a more progressive president than we've had in a while is only the beginning, and it's a very shaky. Its success is not yet assured, and that the argument is only beginning over America's future after the great meltdown of the god of the market in the last 2 or 3 years. In preparation for this, in terms of framing New Press for in the debate argument over America's future, last night I picked up one of the most worn books in my library. It's the original copy I have of Barry Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative. It was written in the 1960s, in 1960, prior to Kennedy's election, or simultaneously with Kennedy's election, in which I took a part, and prior to Lyndon Johnson's domestic programs under the label Great Society. The 1964 election, when we trounced Goldwater, none of us thought that the conservative, we thought history had been settled then. We thought it was the end of history in 1964, when the emerging conservative movement had been crushed by the Kennedy, by Johnson winning in no small part because of Kennedy's legacy. And almost nobody paid any attention to this book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which was ghostwritten for Goldwater by Brent Bozell, whose son, by the way, runs a right-wing group that for 18 years has been trying to discredit journalists like myself by calling us the liberal media. But anyway, I happened to get a copy of The Conscience of a Conservative because I was responsible for much of that LBJ campaign in 1964, and I wanted to see what conservatives were saying. I read it, set it aside, didn't think much would come out of it. Of course, we now know that The Conscience of a Conservative, a book that sold very little in the beginning, became the Bible for what became the conservative movement that then, of course, led to the election of Ronald Reagan, the 2 Bushes, and the counter-revolution that the conservatives mounted and have governed with for the last 25 years. I mention that because I'm just about to finish a book that won't be published until early September. I'm going to be interviewing the author on the journal. Sam Tenenhouse is the most influential person you've probably never heard of. He's the editor of the Sunday New York Times Book Review and the Sunday News of the Week in Review. This is a brilliant book. It's a brief book, but it's very clearly written, and I urge it on all of you. It's called The Death of Conservatism. And it's a remarkable exposition of the history of the last 50 years in which the conservatives rose to power, and as Tenenhouse says, that their revolution became a racket. But nonetheless, he says they're not done. He says they're in the doldrums. They've been repudiated. They're marginalized. They're radicalized. I mean, the loony right is once again dominating the conservative movement as it did in the 40s and 50s, John Birch Society and all that. But in his last chapter, he says they're not done. They're repositioning themselves for the next World War II of the battle, the argument for America. And he says they will do it. Of course, they've got Limbaugh and Fox and all of that. But just as they did in the years after 1964, when book after book, funded by wealthy right-wing philanthropists through the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, just as the conservatives fought book by book, idea by idea to create this coalition that became the movement that finally elected, with the help of an old Goldwaterite named Rehnquist, George W. Bush as president, which was, of course, the apogee and the nadir of the conservative movement. But Tenenhouse, who's followed the conservative movement for a long time, is certain that they will come back with on the printed page, in addition to their electronic circus that they run, and begin the argument for their America all over again. And that's why, even though we have moved into an electronic universe, and even though commercial publishing is abandoning serious ideas by and large, that is why this small, humble, but dynamic little group around New Press is so crucial at this moment. You have to publish many books for one to signify, and you can't know that any particular book will, the difference it will make. Voltaire, I think it was Voltaire, said it, it's with books as with human beings. A very small number play a great part. The rest are lost in the multitude. But just as with anything else in creativity, you have to do a lot of television for one broadcast to really lift off and signify in a way. And I'm positive that if New Press can create a business model for this new round of American history, it will play, with all of our support, a very important role in the new argument for America. And that's why I will do anything I can to see that life is breathed into this hardy warrior that's been out there for these 25 years, laying the groundwork with others for a resurgence of American progressive and inclusive values. And that's my little talk.